In this session, we'll be creating authorization policy for our wired policy set. As part of authorization policy building, it's necessary to configure components that will be applied within that authorization rule, and particularly the authorization profile, which is the package of radius authorization results that's sent towards the NAD. And if that authorization profile includes a DACL, we'll need to pre-build that DACL to nest within the authorization profile. Okay, in looking here, we can go into our policy configuration area. And in addition to policy sets, we see policy elements, and we're focused on policy results. Within policy results, these are generic and not specific to authorization. We see we've got the ability to manage results for authentication rules, specifically the EAP variations that are allowed to be utilized within authentication. And then for authorization here, we see that we can configure downloadable ACLs and authorization profiles. And can't specify the DACL within the authorization profile until it's built, so let's build the DACL first. Cisco's got a couple of default access lists specified in there, pretty easy to understand what they're doing by name. We're going to add our own custom for employee access within our lab environment. And then down below here, just some quick checks. The versions and the box below reference the syntax checker that is done with this DACL box as we enter access list entries. You'll notice that down below we have the opportunity to do a check DACL syntax. This can be a little bit inconsistent in application on ISE, and then understand that not all network devices utilize the same syntax, and particularly for things like masking of network ranges, and that would be different as done in application on an iOS switch compared to an ASA VPN gateway. So in this case, to avoid any complications and have faith that I'll be typing this syntax correctly, we'll check the agnostic to avoid problems. And then understand the best syntax checker is going to be to develop out a mock access list on that network device where this will be applied ultimately. And understand now it will be pushed to that network device and be digested, and that syntax needs to be just so for any aspect of the DACL to be applied. A couple other notes about the syntax of this DACL. Very important that the source IP field in the access list entries be left to keyword any as opposed to a host IP address or network range. This is ultimately will be a session-based access list as the network device applies it towards that particular interface and the user session on that interface, and this source IP any will effectively be treated as the actual host IP address of the endpoint itself. If you put a IP address in here, you will have problems, so we'll want to leave it to keyword any. Develop out a separate policy for contractors. And yeah, the one nice thing about the syntax checker, it would confirm little typos like that one, but there you go, a good eye on that. And then finally an ACL DACL that will specify for our domain computers. In this case, this would allow the domain computer to be able to interact with the network even though a user is not currently accessing that domain computer, and this will allow that domain computer to interact with network resources and maintain Windows updates, maintain a connection with the domain controller. So the three entries, and again notes on the keywords, port values or keywords are acceptable again depending on the device, the network device that will ultimately have to digest this access list. And if again you're not sure of which keyword or numeric values are actually applicable, the best syntax checker is of course the network device that will ultimately be digesting and receiving this DACL. Okay, so we've got our DACLs created. Let's go ahead and move on to create the authorization profiles that will utilize those DACLs. And again, remember the authorization profile are the results that will specify by matching a particular authorization rule. So these are the results that we'll be providing. Notice that with an authorization profile that you can choose to still do a reject despite what an identity source might have specified, that under the conditions that you're specifying that you would rather reject the access as opposed to accept it. And then pointing out down in the authorization profile the variety of things that we can deliver via an authorization profile, matching an authorization rule. We saw the DACL up top there. We can also specify a pre-existing named ACL on the device as opposed to pushing a DACL. We can specify security group information, VLAN changes, voice permissions, web redirection to redirect to a portal, smart port configuration, MACsec, an airspace ACL. This would be one thing that's different about the wireless environment, is that we will need to use an airspace ACL and not a DACL for wireless. So, and more than one thing can be selected depending on the application and of course the device that this authorization profile will be sent towards. And we've checked DACL. When I click the drop down box, I can see that I can select the DACL that I created on the previous screen. And then as I go to save this, I can see the actual radius authorization syntax that will be sent towards that network device managing that endpoint. Okay, let's add a separate one for contractors. And another one for our domain computers. Okay, and just a quick summary there. We've built out the necessary components to complete an authorization rule. The rule typically needs to have an authorization profile specified. We've created those authorization profiles. Each of our current authorization profiles specifies a downloadable ACL to apply towards that user session, and we've just got done building those out. Okay, at this point we'll pause and we'll pick things up by actually developing out the authorization rules themselves and utilizing these components or elements that were built in this session.